Hello there, and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight, we are stepping gently into a possibility that feels unsettling not because it is dramatic, but because it is quiet. The idea that history may not simply be incomplete, but intentionally thinned. That something vast once existed between the distant beginnings of civilization and the earliest records we trust, and that this span did not fade naturally. It may have been removed, not shattered, not burned, not erased in panic, but carefully set aside until what remained could no longer remember what had been lost. If history is usually imagined as a long road stretching behind us, this story begins with the realization that the road may have been shortened, not by erosion or neglect, but by design. The possibility we're exploring is not that the Anunnaki destroyed an age in a moment of violence or divine punishment, but that they ended something by withdrawing memory itself. That an entire phase of human experience was allowed to dissolve without witnesses, without records, without names. That the absence we feel when we look too far back is not an accident of time, but the intended result of intervention. As you settle in, perhaps with the lights lowered and the world around you becoming quieter, allow the idea to unfold slowly. This is not a story about invasion or conquest. It is not about fire from the sky or cities turned to dust. It is about what happens when knowledge becomes a liability, when continuity becomes dangerous, when remembering too much threatens the structure of the world that follows. If you find this kind of exploration soothing, the slow unpacking of old questions and older silences, you're welcome to support the channel by liking the video or subscribing. Not out of urgency, but as a quiet way of staying connected to these long-form journeys into forgotten time. The Sumerian texts, when read carefully and without modern urgency, do not describe history as a single, uninterrupted ascent. They describe layers, periods that end not with collapse but with transition, ages that do not fall but recede. The gods do not always act as destroyers. Sometimes they act as editors. And editing, unlike destruction, leaves no ruins that clearly announce what is missing. The Anunnaki, as they appear in the oldest texts, are not framed as beings obsessed with humanity's progress or survival. They are associated with order, with authority, with the enforcement of boundaries. They appear where lines are drawn, between life and death, between heaven and earth, between what is permitted and what is no longer allowed to continue. When they intervene, it is often not loud. It is procedural, administrative, almost bureaucratic in its calmness. If an entire age had to be removed from human awareness, this is precisely how it would happen, not with spectacle, but with restructuring, not with fear, but with forgetting. The earliest myths speak of a time when humans lived closer to the gods, not just physically, but cognitively. Knowledge was not discovered through generations of trial and error. It was received. Techniques, systems, measurements, and social structures appear suddenly in the archaeological record, already refined, already coherent. Writing does not emerge as scribbles that slowly improve. It appears structured. Agriculture does not begin with random planting. It begins with calendars, seasons, and ritual timing. Kingship does not start as informal leadership. It descends fully formed. These things are often explained as coincidence or compression in the record, but compression itself can be a sign of removal. When a long process is cut out, what remains looks sudden. If there was an age before these gifts were finalized, an age in which humanity was not merely receiving knowledge, but participating in its development alongside the gods, that age would pose a problem, a dangerous one. Because it would mean humans once understood too much. It would mean they once knew where knowledge came from, how it was shaped, and possibly how it could be challenged. Memory is power, not symbolic power, but practical power. A civilization that remembers its previous forms understands that systems are not permanent, that hierarchies can change, that authority is not eternal. If humans remembered an age before limits were imposed, before lifespans were shortened, before access to knowledge was regulated, they might begin to question why those limits exist at all. The Sumerian stories hint at this kind of tension, not openly, but indirectly, through contradictions, through sudden resets, through long genealogies that end abruptly, through kings who rule for tens of thousands of years, followed by kings who do not, through gods who once walked openly among humans and later recede into temples, symbols and law. What if that transition was not natural? What if it was enforced? Erasure does not require violence if compliance can be achieved through time. If you remove teachers, restrict transmission, and allow generations to pass without explanation, knowledge becomes myth. Myth becomes metaphor. Metaphor becomes fiction. Eventually, what was once lived experience is dismissed as imagination. The Anunnaki would not need to destroy cities to erase an age. They would only need to step back at the right moment, to stop correcting errors, to stop renewing memory, to allow decay to do what fire would make too obvious. An erased age would leave behind strange fingerprints, advanced ideas appearing too early, architectural precision without a visible developmental phase, stories shared across cultures that no longer agree on details, only on emotional weight, floods, resets, divine withdrawals, long sleeps, golden ages and times before time. These are not random themes. They are what memory looks like after it has been damaged but not eliminated. Humanity would continue but without context. Survivors would not know what they survived. Children would inherit tools without understanding their origin. Rituals would persist after their meanings faded. Authority would remain, but its justification would be reframed. This is the kind of world the texts describe after certain turning points. A world where humans still serve the gods, but no longer understand why. A world where work continues, but purpose becomes ritualized rather than remembered. A world where history resumes, but something essential is missing from its foundation. If the Anunnaki erased an age, they did not do it to punish humanity. They did it to stabilize reality, to reduce complexity, to prevent recurrence. An uncontrolled partnership between gods and humans may have produced outcomes that could not be allowed to continue. Knowledge shared too freely becomes uncontrollable. Memory preserved too accurately becomes resistant to authority. Forgetting, in that sense, is not cruelty. It is governance. And once forgetting is complete, it does not need to be maintained. Time does the rest. What remains is a civilization that feels ancient but not complete. A history that stretches far back but not far enough. A sense that something foundational is missing without knowing what it was. That is where this story truly begins. Not at the moment of erasure, but in the long aftermath. In the world that continued without realizing it was no longer whole. In the silence that followed, which was not empty, but carefully left that way. From here, the path forward does not lead to destruction or revelation, but to examination, to noticing patterns, to understanding what silence implies, to recognizing that absence, when consistent, is rarely accidental. And as this exploration continues, the question is no longer whether something was erased, but how such an erasure could be so complete that it still shapes us quietly, thousands of years later, without ever announcing itself as loss. There was a time when silence did not yet require an explanation, not because nothing had happened, but because continuity still existed. Memory flowed forward without interruption, and knowledge moved from one generation to the next without gaps large enough to provoke suspicion. The past did not feel distant or broken. It felt close, functional, usable. People did not wonder where things came from in the way later societies would. They knew, or at least believed they knew, because the answers had not yet been removed. In the earliest layers of human tradition, before formal history and before myth fully separated themselves from lived experience, silence was not associated with loss. Quiet spaces in memory were simply pauses, not absences. A missing detail did not imply a missing world. Knowledge was still anchored in continuity rather than reconstruction. The world functioned on the assumption that what existed now was the natural extension of what had existed before. This is the state the oldest texts gesture toward but do not describe directly. A condition where explanation was unnecessary, because context still existed. Where systems did not need to justify themselves because their origins were still understood. Where authority did not need to be mythologized because it had not yet become abstract. Before silence was explained, it did not feel threatening. It did not provoke curiosity or fear. It was not filled with speculation. It was simply part of the rhythm of existence, like night following day or rest following labour. Silence did not yet imply that something had been taken away. In such a world, knowledge was not archived for preservation. It was practiced. It was lived. It existed in routines, in construction, in governance, in ritual that still remembered why it was performed. When knowledge is embodied, it does not require constant verbal reinforcement. It does not need to be written down obsessively. It does not feel fragile. This may be why the earliest human phases leave behind so little that we can confidently label as instructional. Not because nothing was known, but because what was known had not yet been threatened. Preservation becomes urgent only when loss becomes possible. Writing explodes not at the beginning of knowledge, but at the beginning of anxiety about forgetting. If there was an age before erasure, it would be characterized by this kind of confidence. A confidence that did not announce itself, a sense that the world made sense within its own framework. People did not yet look backward and feel uncertainty. They looked backward and saw continuity. The Sumerian tradition hints at this state indirectly. In its descriptions of early order, the world is not chaotic. It is structured, managed, assigned. Gods have roles. Humans have roles. Cities exist in proper relation to rivers, fields, and heavens. Even labour, though burdensome, is integrated into a meaningful system. There is strain, but not confusion. Confusion emerges later. Silence becomes noticeable only after explanation becomes necessary. Only after gaps appear, only after memory begins to fracture. When later scribes describe the world before certain turning points, their tone shifts. They are no longer transmitting lived structure. They are reconstructing. This distinction matters. Reconstruction always carries uncertainty. It introduces narrative smoothing, symbolic language, compression. It replaces process with outcome. The moment a society begins to explain its own silence is the moment it has already lost something. Before that, silence was simply the background of existence. It did not demand interpretation. If the Anunnaki were involved in shaping early human order, their presence would have made explanation unnecessary. Authority was immediate. Knowledge was direct. Boundaries were enforced not through abstraction, but through proximity. Limits were known because they were experienced, not because they were recorded. This kind of world does not produce myths in the way later cultures do. It produces protocols, instructions, structures that work. Myth emerges when distance appears. When the origin of a rule is no longer visible, it must be narrated. When a system continues after its creators withdraw, its logic must be preserved symbolically. Before the silence was explained, the creators had not yet withdrawn. The transition away from this state would not feel like collapse. It would feel like normalization, like stabilization, like things becoming simpler, roles narrowing, knowledge becoming specialized rather than shared, lifespans shortening, authority becoming more rigid rather than negotiated. To those living through it, this would not feel like loss. It would feel like order settling, like chaos being reduced, like unnecessary complexity being removed. This is how erasure hides itself. It does not arrive as disaster. It arrives as clarity. If there was an age where humans participated more directly in knowledge creation or maintenance, that age would be inefficient by later standards. It would be unstable. It would allow for questioning, adaptation, deviation. From the perspective of beings concerned with long-term order, such an age would be risky. Stability requires limitation, and limitation requires forgetting. Silence begins when explanation becomes dangerous. Not immediately, but gradually. Certain topics stop being elaborated. Certain stories stop being retold in full. Certain details are omitted because they complicate authority. Over time, what remains feels complete, even though it is thinner than what came before. Later generations inherit a simplified world and assume it has always been that way. This is the point where silence becomes something that needs explanation. When people notice that myths do not align cleanly, when genealogies stretch impossibly far and then abruptly shorten, when early rulers live impossibly long lives and later ones do not, when techniques appear without developmental stages, when knowledge exists without clear origins, at that stage silence is no longer background. It becomes foreground. It becomes unsettling. But before that moment, before silence was explained, the world simply worked. Humans farmed. Cities were built. Governance existed. Rituals aligned with seasons. Authority was present. The divine order was close enough to feel real, not symbolic. Memory did not yet need to be defended. If the Anunnaki intended to remove an age, this would be the ideal starting point. Not at a moment of chaos, but at a moment of apparent stability, when changes could be introduced as refinements rather than ruptures, when reduction could be framed as organization. The oldest texts do not describe an expulsion from this state. They describe a shift away from it, a change in conditions, a rebalancing, a moment when gods decide something has become excessive. Excess is a revealing word. It implies too much, not wrong, too many humans, too much noise, too much activity, too much unpredictability. When excess is identified, reduction follows. And reduction, unlike destruction, does not need to be dramatic. Silence grows gradually. Memory thins. Explanations are postponed. Over generations, postponement becomes absence. By the time later scribes attempt to reconstruct what came before, the silence is already total. They do not know what is missing, only that something does not align. They fill the gap with symbolism, metaphor, and myth. They preserve fragments without context. From their perspective, silence demands explanation. From the perspective of those who lived before it, silence had not yet arrived. This is the crucial distinction. Erasure does not begin when memory disappears. It begins when memory stops being necessary, when systems continue without reference to their origins, when practice replaces understanding. By the time humanity notices the silence, the age that preceded it is already gone. What remains is not ignorance, but incomplete inheritance. A world that feels ancient, functional, and yet strangely hollow at its foundation. A sense that something foundational is missing, without knowing what it was. And as the narrative continues forward, the silence is no longer passive. It becomes structured, maintained, interpreted. It is woven into cosmology, lore, and myth. The moment silence begins to be explained is the moment it has already succeeded. There are ages remembered because they announce themselves. They carry names, boundaries, rulers, and endings that can be marked. Stone gives way to bronze. Dynasties rise and fall. Floods divide before and after. These periods survive because they leave edges behind. But an age that leaves no name does not end with an edge. It dissolves. It does not collapse into ruin. It thins until what remains can no longer identify what it once was part of. If an entire phase of human existence was erased, this is what it would look like in the record. Not a burned layer, not a gap filled with ash, not a sudden absence of people. Instead, a continuity that feels incomplete, a smooth surface with depth missing beneath it. The kind of past that feels ancient without feeling fully formed. The Sumerian texts never name a beginning for everything. They speak of before and after, But the earliest before is already structured. There is water, there is separation, there is order, there are gods already functioning within a hierarchy. Whatever came before that point is not described, not even symbolically. It is not mythologized, it is simply absent. This absence is more striking than destruction would be. Cultures remember catastrophes. They ritualize them. They encode them into story and ceremony. Even trauma persists in narrative. But a period that leaves no name has not been framed as an event. It has not been acknowledged as something that ended. It has been removed as if it never needed to be remembered. An unnamed age is not forgotten accidentally. Forgetting usually leaves residue, distorted stories, conflicting accounts, emotional traces, but the absence here is clean, too clean. There is no story about losing it, no myth about its destruction, no lament, no warning. It is as though memory itself was redirected before it could mark the loss. Later, civilizations inherit the aftermath without realizing inheritance has been interrupted. When archaeologists encounter sudden sophistication, they call it emergence. When language appears fully structured, they call it development compressed by time. When cities appear with planning already in place, they speak of rapid innovation. These explanations function because there is nothing else to compare against. The unnamed age provides no counterpoint. If an earlier phase existed in which knowledge was not discovered but shared, not accumulated but maintained, it would leave few traces that survive erasure. Tools would be reused, structures would be dismantled rather than abandoned, techniques would be internalized rather than recorded. When memory was withdrawn, there would be no debris announcing what had been lost. Names matter because they anchor identity. To name an age is to acknowledge its existence as distinct. Without a name, it cannot be referenced, it cannot be argued over, it cannot be reclaimed, it cannot even be missed properly. It simply disappears into the assumption that things have always been this way. This is why the earliest named ages already feel constrained. Human lifespans are shorter. Knowledge is specialized. Authority is vertical rather than collaborative. The divine is present, but distant. Law replaces guidance. Ritual replaces understanding. These are not signs of primitive beginnings. They are signs of limitation. An unnamed age would have been too fluid to categorize, too complex to summarize, too unstable to be allowed to persist. It would have lacked the clean divisions that later eras depend on. Humans would not yet be fully separated from the systems that shaped them. Knowledge would not yet be proprietary. Memory would not yet be filtered through institutions. From the perspective of beings concerned with order, such an age would be dangerous, not because it was violent, but because it was unpredictable. Because humans within it might understand the mechanics of authority, might recognize that systems are constructed, might notice that limits are imposed, not natural. Erasure solves this problem without confrontation. The texts do not describe a rebellion that failed. They describe a restructuring that succeeded. They do not speak of punishment for remembering too much. They speak of conditions changing, of decrees being made, of humanity becoming numerous, of noise increasing, of balance being lost. Balance is a revealing word. It suggests that something existed in excess, but excess relative to what? Not relative to scarcity or survival, but relative to governance. Too much life, too much activity, too much presence. An unnamed age would be one in which humanity's presence was not yet constrained by imposed ceilings. Lifespans may have been longer, not because bodies were different, but because conditions were. Knowledge transmission may have been broader, not because minds were superior, but because access was less restricted. Authority may have been negotiable, not because chaos ruled, but because hierarchy was not yet finalized. When that age was removed, its removal was framed not as loss, but as correction. Later myths hint at this without explaining it. They speak of gods deciding, of councils convening, of limits being set, of mortality being fixed, of reproduction being regulated, of distance being established between divine and human realms. None of these are presented as endings, they are presented as necessities. This framing is crucial. If an age is removed under the justification of necessity, it does not need to be remembered. Memory would undermine justification. If people remembered that conditions were once different, necessity could be questioned. So the age is left unnamed. What remains are anomalies. Kings who rule impossibly long lives before a flood resets chronology. Cities that appear as first cities without precursors. Legal systems that descend fully formed. Calendars that assume astronomical knowledge already in place. These are not proofs of lost technology or vanished civilizations in the popular sense. They are signs of missing process, of development that has been deliberately smoothed over. When scribes begin recording history in earnest, they do so after the erasure is complete. They inherit a world that feels settled. Their role is to preserve what exists, not to question what preceded it. They write lists, not inquiries. They copy traditions, not experiments. An unnamed age would leave no instructors behind, no living witnesses, no elders who could say, "This was different once." Those who lived through the transition would age and die within the new limits. Their children would grow up assuming the world had always functioned this way. Time would do the rest. Within a few generations, even the concept of an earlier condition would feel implausible. The idea that humans once knew more, lived longer, or participated differently would be relegated to symbolic stories. Gods walking among people, golden ages, ages of heroes. These become metaphors rather than memories. Once memory is fully mythologized, it no longer threatens authority. The age that left no name does not haunt humanity as nostalgia. It haunts as dissonance, as the feeling that something is missing without knowing what, as the sense that progress begins in the middle of a story. This is why later civilizations constantly reinvent origins. Each culture creates its own beginning because the true beginning is inaccessible. Without a named age to anchor the past, every society must invent a starting point that feels sufficient. But invented beginnings always feel shallow. They do not satisfy the deeper intuition that something came before. The Anunnaki, if they were responsible for erasing such an age, would not need to be remembered as villains or heroes. Their role would not be mythic. It would be administrative. They would be remembered only indirectly, as judges, as determiners of fate, as enforcers of order rather than creators of worlds. Creators are remembered. Editors are not. An unnamed age would be the result of editing history rather than destroying it. Removing excess, removing risk, removing memory that complicates obedience, and once the edit is complete, history resumes as if nothing has happened. This is why the silence feels ancient, why it stretches back beyond myth, why it does not point to a disaster, but to a decision. The age that left no name is not lost because time destroyed it. It is lost because it was never allowed to become history. And as the narrative moves forward, the world that follows behaves as though it is the first of its kind. Not because it truly is, but because it no longer remembers what came before. The silence is already in place. The explanation comes later. There is a subtle but decisive shift that occurs in the oldest traditions, one that is easy to miss because it is not announced as a turning point. No trumpet sounds, no war is described, no single decree is preserved in full. Instead, the relationship between gods and humans changes in tone. What was once instruction becomes supervision. What was once guidance becomes observation. The gods do not vanish. They remain present, but they stop teaching. In the earliest remembered arrangements, knowledge flows downward in a direct and functional way. Techniques are given, systems are demonstrated, order is established through example rather than enforcement. Humans are not left to guess how the world works, they are shown. Agriculture is aligned with seasons not through trial alone, but through revealed timing. Cities are laid out according to patterns that already exist. Authority is justified through proximity to those who understand the structure of reality itself. Teaching implies investment. It requires patience. It assumes that the recipient is capable of understanding not just what to do, but why it is done that way. Teaching also creates continuity. A taught society can adapt because it understands principles rather than just rules. At some point that changes. The gods do not withdraw abruptly. They remain embedded in law, ritual and cosmology. Temples are still built. Offerings are still made. Festivals still mark the calendar. But instruction fades. Knowledge stops expanding. It stabilizes. The same forms are repeated rather than developed. The same stories are recited rather than explored. This is the moment when watching replaces teaching. Watching does not require explanation. It does not foster understanding. It enforces compliance through presence rather than insight. A watched society learns to behave correctly without knowing why correctness matters. Over time, this produces obedience without comprehension. The Sumerian texts preserve traces of this transition without naming it directly. Early compositions speak of gods assigning roles, distributing domains, and establishing procedures. Later texts emphasize judgment, decree, and fate. The divine voice shifts from instruction to evaluation. Humans are no longer students, they are subjects. This shift would be necessary if an earlier age had become too complex to manage. Teaching creates variables. Understanding leads to experimentation. Experimentation leads to divergence. From the perspective of beings responsible for maintaining cosmic order, divergence is dangerous. Watching simplifies the system. Once teaching ends, knowledge freezes at an acceptable level. Innovation becomes suspect. Deviations are framed as transgressions rather than discoveries. Curiosity is redirected into ritual rather than inquiry. Humans continue to function, but they no longer participate in shaping the structure they live within. The gods, in this configuration, become overseers rather than mentors. Oversight is efficient. It requires less energy. It scales better. It allows a small number of authorities to monitor a large population without engaging deeply with individual understanding. If the Anunnaki were involved in enforcing limits after an unnamed age, this is precisely the mode they would adopt. The texts associate them increasingly with judgment rather than creation, with fate rather than instruction, with the underworld rather than the living world. These associations are not arbitrary. They reflect a role change. The Anunnaki are no longer shaping humanity's path. They are ensuring it does not deviate. Teaching would have been necessary when humans were still learning how to exist within a newly ordered world. Watching becomes necessary once that order is fixed. This transition also explains why divine-human contact becomes more formalized. Early stories describe direct interaction. Gods speak plainly. They walk. They intervene in practical matters. Later interactions are mediated through priests, omens, and dreams. Access becomes indirect. Communication becomes symbolic. Distance is not absence. It is control. When gods stop teaching, humans lose access to underlying logic. Systems continue to operate, but they are no longer transparent. Law persists, but its rationale is no longer debated. Ritual continues, but its origin is no longer remembered. Authority remains, but it becomes self-justifying. This is how an erased age stays erased. If humans remembered being taught, they would remember a time when learning was open-ended. They would remember that knowledge could be shared, expanded, questioned. Watching prevents that memory from forming. Surveillance does not transmit context. It only transmits consequence. From this point onward, human behavior is shaped not by understanding the structure of reality, but by avoiding punishment and seeking favor. Morality shifts from coherence to compliance. Wisdom shifts from comprehension to obedience. The gods, meanwhile, become less human in their portrayal. Early depictions emphasize personality, argument, even error. Later depictions emphasize authority, inevitability, and distance. The divine becomes less relatable and more absolute. This change is often misinterpreted as religious evolution, as humans projecting increasing abstraction onto their gods. But it can also be read as the result of withdrawal. When teaching ends, relationship degrades into hierarchy. Hierarchy does not explain itself. It enforces itself. A watched society internalizes limits without understanding their origin. Mortality is accepted as natural rather than imposed. Shortened lifespans become normal rather than reduced. Knowledge ceilings feel inherent rather than artificial. The gods do not need to remind humans of what they have lost. Humans no longer know that anything was lost. Watching also allows for selective intervention. When humans approach forbidden thresholds, signs appear. Omens warn, dreams redirect, disasters correct. These are not teaching moments. They are course corrections. A teacher explains why the rule exists. A watcher enforces the rule without explanation. This distinction matters deeply. A taught civilization can rebuild after collapse because it understands principles. A watched civilization can only repeat patterns. When patterns break, it turns to ritual and myth rather than innovation. This may explain why post-erasure humanity struggles to recover certain capacities. Techniques are rediscovered slowly, imperfectly. Architecture regains precision over centuries. Writing systems simplify and then complicate again. Knowledge loops rather than progresses smoothly. The missing age would have been the age of teaching. Its removal leaves humanity permanently in a learning-disabled state, capable of copying but not fully understanding. The gods, by watching instead of teaching, ensure that this condition persists. In this framework, divine silence is not neglect. It is policy. The Anunnaki, associated with fate and judgment, would be ideally positioned to enforce such a policy. They do not need to inspire. They need to observe outcomes and intervene when boundaries are crossed. Their presence is felt most strongly at moments of decision, death, and transition. Life proceeds under watchful eyes rather than guiding hands. Humans respond by externalizing meaning. They seek signs, they interpret omens, they obey laws whose origins they no longer question. Theology shifts from explanation to appeasement. This is not a fallen state in the moral sense. It is a managed state. The world continues. Crops grow. Cities rise and fall. Empires form. But the depth of participation has been reduced. Humanity lives inside a system rather than alongside its architects. When the gods stopped teaching and started watching, history did not end. It narrowed. From that point forward, the past becomes increasingly symbolic. The future becomes increasingly constrained, and the present feels stable, but strangely incomplete. The watchers do not need to be remembered as teachers. Their success depends on being remembered as judges, and as the story continues, the consequences of that shift ripple outward. Not immediately, not dramatically, but steadily, shaping how humanity understands authority, knowledge, time, and itself. The silence deepens, not because nothing is happening, but because what once explained the world no longer speaks. What remains after an age is erased is not emptiness, it is clutter. Fragments scattered without instructions, evidence without context. Objects, structures and patterns that survive not because they were meant to be remembered, but because they were useful enough to be reused, or resilient enough to resist decay. These remnants do not announce themselves as survivors of something greater. They simply exist, quietly unsettling anyone who looks too closely. Traces without stories are the most effective form of erasure. A destroyed civilization leaves ruins that demand explanation. A forgotten one leaves foundations that are incorporated into what comes next. Walls are rebuilt, stones are repurposed, techniques are copied. When this happens, continuity is simulated even though understanding is gone. The surface remains intact while the depth disappears. This is the condition that defines much of early human history as we encounter it now. We find evidence of precision without manuals, geometry without recorded derivation, astronomical alignment without developmental stages. Systems appear functional but not narrated. They work, but they do not explain themselves. In such a world, later cultures assume these things were invented by those who used them. That assumption feels natural. It avoids discomfort. It preserves the belief that progress begins where memory begins. But the traces themselves suggest something else. They suggest inheritance without explanation. Stone structures aligned to celestial events do not require a story to function. Calendars can be followed without understanding how they were constructed. Irrigation systems can be maintained long after their original logic is forgotten. Writing can be copied without knowing why its structure is the way it is. This is how knowledge survives erasure. It is reduced to utility. The Sumerian texts themselves reflect this condition. They preserve lists, formulas, rituals, and laws, but rarely describe how these systems were discovered or developed. They begin in the middle. The gods assign, humans receive. The process that led to these assignments is absent. That absence is not accidental. If an earlier age existed in which humans participated in shaping these systems alongside the gods, its removal would require leaving the systems intact while severing their origin stories. Destroying the systems would destabilize the world. Destroying the stories stabilizes it. What remains are traces that feel older than the narratives attached to them. This is why so many ancient myths feel like explanations added after the fact. Stories emerge to justify practices that already exist. Gods are assigned domains that align neatly with existing human activities. A deity of agriculture appears after agriculture is already central. A god of law presides over legal systems that are already functioning. The story follows the trace, not the other way around. Traces without stories also create the illusion of sudden genius. When a culture inherits a system it does not understand, refinement slows, innovation becomes cautious, deviations feel risky. The system is treated as sacred rather than experimental. This is visible in early monumental architecture. Precision exists, but variation is limited. Forms are repeated with reverence. Builders do not ask whether a different approach might work better. They assume the existing one is correct because it came from a time closer to the gods. This reverence is not superstition. It is recognition of lost understanding. When people know they are copying something they do not fully grasp, they avoid altering it. An erased age would leave behind exactly this psychology. Humanity would continue to use inherited tools while losing the confidence to modify them. Knowledge becomes static not because it is perfect, but because its origin is inaccessible. Stories normally provide permission to change. They explain why something exists and therefore how it might be adapted. Without stories, systems harden. The archaeological record is filled with this kind of hardness. Long periods of apparent stagnation where techniques persist unchanged for centuries. Then sudden shifts, often following collapse or migration, when inherited systems finally break down enough to be reimagined. But even these shifts rarely reconstruct the original depth. They produce new systems rather than recover old ones. Traces without stories also distort time. When a process is removed from memory, its outcome appears instantaneous. Writing appears suddenly. Mathematics appears fully formed. Social hierarchy appears without visible negotiation. Later observers mistake this for rapid development, but rapid development is often a sign of missing phases. If the Anunnaki erased an age, they would have done so by allowing its functional outputs to remain while withdrawing the narrative that explained how those outputs came to be. Humanity would inherit the results without inheriting the reasoning. This is far more effective than destruction. Destruction invites curiosity. Survival invites complacency. Consider how few ancient cultures preserve detailed accounts of experimentation. Trial and error is rarely recorded. Failure almost never is. Texts present systems as given, not discovered. This framing removes human agency from the origin of knowledge. Agency is dangerous. A society that remembers inventing something knows it can invent again. A society that believes knowledge was given treats it as finite. The Sumerians explicitly frame many foundational aspects of civilization as divine gifts. Kingship descends from heaven. Agriculture is granted by gods. Writing is bestowed. This framing may not reflect actual origins. It may reflect an already completed erasure. By the time writing exists, the story of how writing emerged has already been removed. Traces without stories also appear in mythic geography. Cities are described as first cities, but no earlier settlements are named. Sacred places exist without prior history. Eridu is already ancient when it enters the record. Its foundation is not described, it simply is. This kind of timelessness is a sign of narrative severance. The place exists, but its becoming does not. In a fully remembered world, becoming matters. Origins are traced, lineages debated. In an erased world, origins are asserted. Assertion replaces memory. The Anunnaki, associated with authority and fate, would have no need to preserve stories of an age they intended to end. Their function would be to ensure continuity of order, not continuity of understanding. If order could persist without story, that would be the preferred outcome. Stories create alternatives. Alternatives create instability. Traces alone do not. This also explains why so many ancient myths feel fragmented. Characters appear briefly, perform decisive actions and vanish. Motivations are thin. Consequences are disproportionate. These stories are not incomplete because they were poorly told. They are incomplete because they are all that remains. They are compression artifacts. Compression removes detail while preserving shape. The shape of an event remains recognizable even when its internal logic is lost. Flood stories retain the outline of catastrophe while losing the specifics. Golden ages retain the sense of difference while losing the mechanics. What is missing is not narrative flair. It is procedural memory. Procedural memory is the most threatening kind. It teaches not just what happened, but how it happened. It allows repetition. An erased age would be stripped of procedural memory first. This leaves humanity with symbolic memory, myths that gesture rather than instruct, rituals that reenact without explaining, laws that command without justifying. The traces left behind become increasingly mysterious with time. Later cultures reinterpret them according to new frameworks. Symbols are repurposed. Structures are mythologized. What was once practical becomes sacred. Sacralization is another form of erasure. When something becomes sacred, it is removed from questioning. It is preserved unchanged. Its origin becomes irrelevant. This process ensures that traces remain intact, while stories fade completely. If there was once an age where humans learned directly from the gods, that learning would have included understanding not just outcomes, but methods. The removal of that age would require severing access to methods while leaving outcomes usable. This is exactly what we observe. Humanity becomes highly skilled at maintenance but less confident at innovation. Progress continues, but in cycles rather than lines. Knowledge is rediscovered rather than extended. Every rediscovery feels like a breakthrough, but it never quite matches the inherited traces. The result is a persistent sense of insufficiency, a feeling that modern humans are always catching up to something already achieved long ago. This feeling does not come from romanticism. It comes from mismatch, from evidence that does not align with narrative. Traces without stories create cognitive dissonance. They invite speculation, but resist certainty. They suggest depth while denying access. This is why the idea of a lost age persists across cultures, not because of conspiracy, but because the human mind seeks coherence. When coherence is missing, it fills gaps. But the gaps themselves were engineered to be unfillable. If the Anunnaki erased an age, they did so thoroughly enough that humanity could never reconstruct it fully, only feel its absence. And that absence becomes a feature of the world that follows. Civilizations rise believing themselves to be beginnings. They fall without realizing they were continuations. Each new culture assumes it is inventing what it is actually inheriting. The traces remain, the stories do not. As the narrative moves forward, these traces become increasingly layered. Each era builds atop the previous one, further burying what little remains. By the time modern observers arrive, the original age is not just forgotten, it is structurally inaccessible. All that is left are objects, alignments, patterns, and systems that feel older than explanation. And silence, now deepened, no longer feels empty, it feels deliberate. The world continues to function, but the story that once explained why it functions that way is gone. What remains is history that works without understanding, and that may have been the point all along. There comes a point in any system where memory stops being neutral, where remembering no longer preserves stability but threatens it. This moment does not arrive with panic or collapse. It arrives quietly, when accumulated knowledge begins to outpace the structure that contains it. When the past becomes a tool rather than a reference. When memory starts to reveal not just what was done, but what could be done again. This is the moment when memory becomes dangerous. Before this point, remembering strengthens order. It allows continuity. It reinforces legitimacy. The past explains the present and gives it weight. Authority draws power from history because history supports it. But once memory exposes that authority itself was shaped, negotiated, revised, or imposed, remembrance begins to undermine obedience. An erased age would have reached this threshold. If humans once remembered a time before limits were fixed, before lifespans were shortened, before access to knowledge was restricted, that memory would eventually become incompatible with enforced order. Even if people accepted limits in practice, remembering their origin would keep those limits provisional, temporary, subject to revision, that cannot be allowed to persist. The Sumerian texts, when read carefully, suggest a subtle anxiety around memory itself. They preserve lists obsessively. Kings, cities, offerings, decrees. They fix names and sequences with care but avoid describing processes. Memory is curated. What's remembered is stable. What could destabilize is omitted. This selectivity is not accidental. It reflects a shift in how memory is treated. Not as something to be expanded, but as something to be managed. The moment memory became dangerous is the moment teaching ended and watching began, when knowledge ceased to be shared freely and instead became segmented, controlled, passed through gates, priests, rituals, omens, dreams. Interpretation replaced explanation. At that point, remembering too much was no longer a virtue, it was a liability. If humans remembered an earlier arrangement where gods and humans worked in closer proximity, that memory would raise questions about current distance. If they remembered participating in decisions, they would question decrees. If they remembered extended lifespans, they would question mortality. If they remembered unrestricted knowledge, they would question why certain things were now forbidden. Memory does not need to be rebellious to be dangerous. It only needs to be accurate. This is why erasure focuses on memory rather than population. Killing removes bodies. Erasure removes continuity. A population can be controlled if it forgets its previous conditions. It will accept new limits as natural. The transition from living memory to symbolic memory marks this turning point. Lived memory contains detail, nuance, contradiction. Symbolic memory compresses, it abstracts. It replaces experience with narrative. Once memory becomes symbolic, it can be shaped without resistance. Myth is not memory. It is memory rendered safe, An erased age would be remembered, if at all, only through mythic distortion. Golden ages without mechanics. Long lives without explanation. Gods walking among humans without context. These stories preserve emotional truth while removing procedural threat. This is containment. The gods, particularly those associated with fate and judgment, would be responsible for enforcing such containment. Their role would shift from cultivating understanding to regulating outcomes. They would not need to silence memory directly. They would only need to redirect it into forms that do not invite replication. Memory becomes dangerous when it teaches methods. Methods can be repeated, improved, challenged. A society that remembers how something was built can rebuild it differently. A society that only remembers that something existed treats it as unchangeable. This distinction defines the boundary between participation and obedience. The Sumerian record shows clear signs that this boundary has already been crossed by the time writing becomes prominent. Writing records outcomes, not experiments. Laws appear complete, not provisional. Cosmology is fixed, not debated. Even divine conflict is stylized rather than analyzed. This suggests that the moment memory became dangerous occurred before the bulk of textual preservation began. By the time scribes were writing, the erasure was already in place. Memory management is most effective when it precedes record keeping. Once writing exists, erasure must work differently. It must operate through omission, canonization, and repetition, rather than destruction. Certain texts are copied endlessly, others are not. Certain interpretations become standard, others vanish. But before writing, memory exists primarily in people. That is where danger lies. If an earlier age allowed humans to understand the structure of reality too deeply, erasure would require ensuring that no generation carried that understanding forward intact. The simplest method would be gradual. Allow those who remember to age and die under new constraints. Ensure that their children inherit function without explanation. Within a few generations, memory becomes thin enough to control. This process does not require violence. It requires patience. Limits imposed after erasure would be framed as natural. Mortality would be accepted as inherent. Ignorance would be normalized. Authority would be justified through divine distance rather than shared knowledge. At that point, remembering more than one's allotted portion becomes transgressive. Knowledge is no longer neutral. It is regulated. This regulation appears in later traditions as taboo. Forbidden knowledge, hidden names, restricted rituals, secrets reserved for initiates, wisdom guarded by priesthoods. These are not features of a world discovering knowledge. They are features of a world containing it. A contained society fears unmediated memory. The Anunnaki, associated with decreeing fate rather than generating life, would function as enforcers of such containment. Fate is the opposite of memory. Fate fixes outcomes regardless of origin. It renders the past irrelevant. When fate governs, remembering how things came to be does not change what will happen. This is a powerful tool. Once fate becomes central, memory can be tolerated only in forms that reinforce inevitability. Stories that emphasize destiny rather than agency. Myths where attempts to escape fate fail. Narratives where knowledge does not grant freedom, only suffering. These themes appear repeatedly. They are warnings disguised as entertainment. Memory becomes dangerous precisely when it suggests alternatives. An erased age would be one in which alternatives existed openly, multiple paths, negotiated structures, shared understanding. Its removal would mark the point where alternatives were no longer permitted. From then on, memory would be curated to support singular narratives. This also explains the emergence of shame around curiosity. Questioning authority becomes impiety. Seeking forbidden knowledge becomes hubris. Remembering too much becomes arrogance. These moral frames do not arise spontaneously. They are cultivated. A society that once knew more must be taught not to seek that knowledge again. Erasure is not complete until desire itself is redirected. When humans stop wanting to remember differently, the erasure succeeds. By the time later civilizations encounter the remnants of earlier complexity, they interpret them as divine mysteries rather than lost understanding. Mystery inspires reverence, not replication. It preserves distance. Distance preserves control. This is why the erased age leaves behind awe rather than instruction. Why monuments inspire wonder but not clarity. Why myths feel profound but unhelpful. The moment memory became dangerous is the moment humanity crossed from participant to subject. From that point forward, knowledge becomes hierarchical, access is controlled, interpretation is mediated, memory is filtered through authority. What remains of the erased age survives only in indirect form, in inconsistencies, in anomalies, in the persistent feeling that something does not align. But alignment is no longer the goal. Stability is. A stable world does not need to make sense in full. It only needs to function. The Anunnaki, if they erased an age, would have acted not as destroyers, but as administrators of risk. Memory would be the risk. Erasure would be the solution. Once implemented, the system would require little maintenance. Humans would police their own curiosity. Societies would mythologize their ignorance. History would restart from a point deemed safe. And the dangerous memory once lived would fade into silence. Not because it was false, but because it worked too well. When something is destroyed, it leaves evidence of force, scars that announce what happened, burned layers, broken continuity, trauma that insists on being remembered. Destruction is loud, even when time dulls its edges. It demands explanation because it disrupts. A removal, by contrast, is quiet. It leaves structure standing. It preserves function. It alters nothing that would draw immediate attention. If an entire age was erased, it was not destroyed. It was removed. Removal is precise. It targets what creates instability while leaving what maintains order. It does not tear down cities. It does not shatter systems. It does not announce itself as an ending. It simply withdraws certain elements until what remains feels complete on its own. This distinction explains why there is no clear rupture in the oldest records, no universal story of annihilation, no shared memory of a lost world burning. Instead, there is continuity that feels thinner than it should, a sense that history resumes without fully beginning. Destruction would have required recovery. Removal requires adjustment. The Sumerian worldview preserves multiple moments of adjustment. Lifespans shorten. Human roles become more defined. Divine presence becomes mediated. Knowledge becomes segmented. These changes are not described as punishments. They are described as corrections, necessary responses to imbalance. Correction implies subtraction, not obliteration. A removed age would be one where subtraction solved a problem, where complexity was reduced because complexity had become unmanageable, where shared understanding was replaced with compartmentalized knowledge because shared understanding allowed too much deviation. In such a process, nothing needs to be broken, only disconnected. People can continue to farm without knowing why the calendar works. Builders can raise walls without understanding the geometry embedded in their design. Priests can recite rituals without knowing their original function. Kings can rule without remembering the negotiations that once shaped authority. The world continues, but something essential is no longer accessible. This is why the oldest civilizations do not behave like pioneers. They behave like inheritors. They guard traditions rather than invent them. They preserve forms rather than experiment with them. Innovation occurs, but cautiously, often framed as restoration rather than novelty. Removal creates reverence. When the origin of a system is no longer known, it becomes untouchable. Change feels dangerous. Authority feels absolute. The past becomes sacred not because it is fully remembered, but because it is no longer understood. A destroyed age would provoke rebuilding. A removed age provokes preservation. The Anunnaki, associated with fate and judgment rather than creation, would have no interest in provoking chaos. Their role would be to stabilize the world after an excess had been identified. Excess does not require elimination of all that exists, it requires trimming. This trimming would focus on memory, access, and agency. Memory would be reduced to myth. Access to knowledge would be restricted to function rather than principle. Agency would be narrowed to obedience rather than participation. None of this would feel violent to those living through it. It would feel like clarification, like order settling into place, like uncertainty being resolved. Those who remembered more would age and die within the new limits. Those born after would inherit a simpler world and assume it had always been that way. Time would smooth the transition. Within a few generations, the removed age would no longer exist as a comparison point. It would not be remembered as loss. It would not be mourned. It would not even be missed consciously. What remains after removal is not emptiness, but normalization. This explains why later myths speak of gods leaving, not dying, of withdrawal, not defeat, of distance, not destruction. The divine does not fall, it steps back. The world does not collapse, it adjusts. Removal preserves dignity. Destruction invites rebellion. If humans believed an age was destroyed unjustly, resentment would linger. If they never realize an age was removed, compliance becomes natural. This is governance at its most effective. The removal would also explain why so many ancient traditions emphasize limits as fundamental truths. Mortality is framed as inherent. Knowledge ceilings are framed as natural. Curiosity beyond certain bounds is framed as hubris. These are not observations, they are reinforcements. A removed age would have included different boundaries that could not be allowed to remain visible, so they were withdrawn. What is striking is how little effort seems to have been required to maintain this state afterward. Once removal is complete, the system sustains itself. Humans enforce limits on one another. Institutions form to guard knowledge. Fear of transgression replaces curiosity. The gods no longer need to intervene constantly. Watching is enough. This suggests that removal occurred early, before large populations could resist, before writing could preserve alternate versions, before memory could fragment into competing accounts. By the time writing appears, the world has already been simplified. Texts record what exists, not what was taken away. This is why no tablet says, "an age was removed." The absence of such a statement is not evidence against removal, it is evidence of success. Removal is complete when it leaves no vocabulary behind. Destruction leaves ruins, removal leaves silence. The silence we encounter when we look too far back is not chaotic, it is orderly. It does not scream, it does not confuse, it simply offers nothing to hold on to. That kind of silence does not come from catastrophe, it comes from editing. If the Anunnaki erased an age, they did so by subtracting memory, not matter, by withdrawing context, not structures, by narrowing humanity's relationship to knowledge rather than severing it entirely. The world that followed is not broken. It is constrained, and constraints, once accepted as natural, no longer feel imposed. This is why the erased age cannot be recovered through excavation alone. There are no ruins that announce it, only patterns that feel incomplete, systems that feel inherited, traditions that feel older than their explanations. The removal did not end history. It reset its starting point. Everything after appears to be a beginning because what came before was quietly taken away. And as the narrative moves forward, this removal shapes every subsequent development, not as an event remembered, but as a condition lived. The silence deepens, not because nothing happened, but because what happened left nothing that could easily be named. Not a destruction, but a removal. And removal leaves the world intact enough that no one notices what is missing until much later, when it is already far out of reach. Forgetting is often imagined as the result of violence. Libraries burned, cities destroyed, people scattered, History erased by force, but force leaves traces. Even the most thorough destruction produces memory through absence. Burned places are remembered as burned. Destroyed cultures become symbols of loss. Their endings become stories that refuse to disappear. A world forgotten without burning follows a different logic entirely. It disappears not because it is attacked, but because it is no longer reinforced. Its memory is allowed to expire naturally, like a language no longer spoken or a skill no longer taught. Nothing dramatic marks its passing. No one declares its end. It simply stops being carried forward. This is the most complete form of erasure. An entire world does not need to be destroyed if the conditions that sustain memory are quietly removed. Memory is not a passive archive. It is an active process. It requires repetition, transmission, context, and relevance. When any one of these is disrupted, memory weakens. When all are disrupted together, memory dissolves completely. If an age existed before recorded history in which humans lived within a different structure of knowledge, authority, and understanding, it could be forgotten entirely without violence if its transmission was halted at the right moment. No fires would be needed, only silence. The Sumerian material does not preserve images of annihilation at the beginning of time. It preserves images of withdrawal. Gods leave rather than fall. Knowledge is redistributed rather than destroyed. Order is adjusted rather than rebuilt. This language is consistent. It suggests change without chaos. Burning is inefficient. It provokes reaction. It creates survivors who remember what was lost and why. Forgetting without burning creates no such witnesses. To erase a world quietly, 4 things must be addressed: continuity, instruction, language, and purpose. Continuity can be broken by shortening lifespans. When people live long lives, memory accumulates naturally. They remember not just events, but conditions. They compare. They notice change. When lifespans shorten, memory fragments. Elders die before transmitting full context. Children grow up within new limits and assume they are universal. Instruction can be halted by ending teaching while preserving function. People continue to perform tasks without learning principles. Skills become rote. Ritual replaces explanation. Once instruction stops, knowledge no longer evolves. It stabilizes at a level deemed safe. Language can be narrowed by reducing vocabulary related to process. Words that describe how things came to be disappear. Words that describe what is remain. Over time, people lose the ability to even articulate certain kinds of questions. What cannot be named cannot be remembered. Purpose can be reframed. When systems are presented as natural rather than constructed, memory loses relevance. Why remember how something was built if it is believed to have always existed? These 4 shifts do not require destruction. They require time. A forgotten world would leave behind infrastructure without origin, systems without stories, practices without explanation. These remnants would not feel foreign. They would feel inherited. The archaeological record reflects exactly this condition. We see continuity of settlement, continuity of agriculture, continuity of ritual. But we do not see continuity of explanation. The deeper we go, the more we encounter function without narrative. This is why the idea of a lost world persists even in the absence of dramatic evidence. It is not the presence of ruins that suggests loss. It is the absence of context. Burning destroys context violently. Removal erodes it quietly. Consider how many ancient techniques were lost not through catastrophe, but through disuse. Roman concrete, Greek fire, complex weaving methods, astronomical calculations. These did not vanish overnight. They faded because the conditions that supported their transmission disappeared. No one burned the knowledge. It simply stopped being passed on. Scale this process up, and an entire world could disappear. If the Anunnaki were involved in overseeing a transition away from an earlier age, Their goal would not be to eliminate humanity's achievements. Those achievements supported order. Their goal would be to eliminate humanity's understanding of how those achievements came to be. Understanding invites replication. Replication invites variation. Variation invites instability. A world forgotten without burning is one that has been stabilized. The removal of direct divine instruction would be central to this process. As long as gods taught openly, memory would remain anchored in explanation. Once teaching stopped, knowledge would become brittle. Over generations, brittle knowledge fractures. Writing accelerates this fracture rather than preventing it. Writing preserves outcomes but strips context. A law written down without the debate that produced it becomes absolute. A ritual recorded without the reasoning behind it becomes sacred. Writing freezes memory at a surface level. This is why writing often appears after erasure has begun, not before. It preserves what remains, not what was lost. A forgotten world would also leave behind inconsistent myths, stories that feel incomplete, characters that appear fully formed and vanish, events that are hinted at but not described. These are not failures of storytelling. They are compression artifacts, evidence of memory that has been reduced to fit within new constraints. Burning removes stories violently. Compression removes them gently. A world forgotten without burning also avoids guilt. There is no crime to reckon with, no injustice to correct, no enemy to curse. The transition feels inevitable rather than imposed. This matters deeply. A destroyed world demands explanation. A forgotten world demands nothing. Human societies are remarkably capable of adapting to loss if they do not perceive it as loss. They fill gaps with assumption. They normalize absence. They build identities around what remains. If an earlier age was removed, its removal would be invisible to those living afterward. They would inherit a world that feels complete. They would develop pride in rediscovering fragments, not realizing they are reconstructing what was once ordinary. This process also explains why later civilizations often believe themselves to be exceptional. They see complexity where none existed before, unaware that complexity once existed at a deeper level. The idea of progress thrives in a world with missing memory. Forgetting without burning also preserves authority. When no one remembers alternatives, the current structure feels final. When no one remembers negotiation, decree feels natural. When no one remembers participation, obedience feels appropriate. The Anunnaki, associated with fate rather than freedom, would have no need to enforce this world continuously. Once forgetting is complete, the system perpetuates itself. Humans become the custodians of their own limitation. This is why the silence at the beginning of history feels deliberate. It is not chaotic. It is not confused. It is orderly. It offers no contradictions to resolve. It simply does not speak. A burned world leaves smoke. A forgotten world leaves habits. Those habits become culture. Culture becomes identity. Identity resists revision. Even when anomalies are noticed, they are explained away. Sudden sophistication becomes genius. Missing development becomes mystery. Long timelines become myth. The absence itself becomes normalized. If an entire world could be forgotten without burning, this is how it would happen. Slowly, quietly, without witnesses, without guilt, without revolt. It would not require secrecy. It would require patience. Time would do the rest. Generations would pass, memory would thin, stories would simplify, language would lose precision, purpose would be reframed. Eventually, even the idea that something had been forgotten would feel speculative. Only the traces would remain. Structures that work too well, systems that feel older than explanation, myths that gesture without teaching. And silence, now fully embedded, would no longer feel like absence. It would feel like the natural beginning of everything. This is the final success of forgetting without burning. The erased world does not haunt humanity as loss. It shapes humanity as foundation. And by the time the question arises of what came before, the answer is already unreachable. Not because it was destroyed, but because it was never allowed to remain remembered. The world continues, the fire never came, and nothing was left behind that could clearly say what was gone. Survival is usually understood as a response to catastrophe. Something happens, something ends. Those who remain know what they endured. They carry memory forward as warning or identity. But there is another kind of survival, quieter and far more disorienting. Survival without context. Survival without explanation. Survival in which the survivors are never told what it was they survived. If an age was removed rather than destroyed, this would be its human aftermath. The people who lived through the transition would not experience themselves as survivors of a lost world. They would experience themselves as inhabitants of a world that had changed. Conditions would narrow gradually. Knowledge would be redistributed subtly. Lifespans would shorten over generations rather than overnight. Authority would reorganize itself without dramatic rupture. From inside this process, nothing would feel like an ending. Those who had lived closer to the earlier age would notice change, but not necessarily its meaning. They might sense that something had become inaccessible, that explanations no longer arrived, that certain questions no longer had answers. But sensing loss is not the same as understanding it. Without language to name what's happening, perception remains private. Private perceptions do not survive long. Children born into the new conditions would have no reference point at all. They would inherit systems already simplified. They would learn procedures without learning origins. They would accept limits as natural features of existence. They would not know that something else had once been possible. These are survivors who do not know they survived. The Sumerian texts hint at this condition through their treatment of early humanity. Humans are created, placed into labour, given systems, and governed. But there is no extended narrative of adaptation, no memory of humans adjusting to loss, no stories of mourning a previous way of being. Humanity appears already acclimated to limitation. This suggests that any transition occurred outside the preserved narrative frame. It was not recorded because it was not acknowledged as trauma. It was framed as normalization. Survivors without knowledge of survival do not resist. They do not preserve warnings. They do not tell their children what was taken. They adapt completely. This is the most stable outcome. A society that remembers catastrophe carries tension. It remembers injustice. It may seek restoration. A society that does not know it survived anything feels no such pull. It builds forward rather than looking back. If the Anunnaki intended to erase an age permanently, this would be the necessary human condition afterward. Survivors would be allowed, even needed. Humanity would continue to serve functions. Cities would persist. Agriculture would expand. But no one would remember what had been reduced. Survival without memory produces obedience without resentment. Those closest to the transition might retain fragments, a sense of difference, a feeling that the world used to be larger or closer or more intelligible. But without reinforcement, such feelings fade. They are not taught. They are not validated. They are not recorded. Within 1 or 2 generations, they become intuition without explanation. Within 3 or 4, they disappear entirely. This process does not require suppression. It requires indifference. When questions receive no answers, they stop being asked. When elders do not teach context, children do not seek it. Survivors who are never told what they survived grow up believing the world they inhabit is complete. This also explains why early human cultures do not express nostalgia for a lost age in concrete terms. They speak of golden ages abstractly, of gods walking among humans, of times before time. These are not memories, they are impressions, echoes of something felt rather than known. An impression cannot guide action. It cannot be rebuilt. It can only be revered or dismissed. The flood narratives illustrate this dynamic clearly. The world before the flood is described as different, but not in procedural detail. Long lifespans, direct divine contact, different rules, but how those rules functioned is never explained. Survivors emerge into a new world with limits fixed and conditions altered. Ziusudra survives the flood, but he does not rebuild the old world. He does not teach others how it was structured. He is removed from human society entirely, placed in Dilmun, a living witness who is deliberately isolated. This is not an accident of storytelling. It is a pattern. Survivors who know too much are removed from circulation. Those who remain are allowed to continue, but without context. This pattern would apply not just to floods, but to any broader erasure. Those who remembered the erased age most clearly would not pass that memory on. Either they would die under new constraints, or they would be symbolically removed from history, transformed into mythical figures whose experiences could not be verified or replicated. What remains is a population that carries on without knowing it has inherited a diminished world. This condition reshapes identity. People define themselves by what they do, not by what was lost. Labour becomes purpose. Obedience becomes virtue. Curiosity becomes risk. Survivors without memory do not rebel. They innovate within limits. They accept boundaries. They turn inherited systems into traditions rather than tools. From the perspective of cosmic administration, this is ideal. The Anunnaki, associated with fate and judgment rather than mentorship, would not need to explain what had been done. Explanation invites evaluation. Evaluation invites resistance. Silence invites adaptation. The psychological effect of this kind of survival is profound. Humans become oriented toward the present rather than the past. They build identity around continuity rather than recovery. They do not ask what was taken, because they do not know that anything was. When anomalies appear, they are absorbed into myth rather than inquiry. When traces are encountered, they are attributed to gods rather than ancestors. When systems seem too advanced, they are labelled gifts rather than inheritances. This is not ignorance, it is conditioned perception. A society that survives without knowing it survived becomes remarkably resilient. It does not dwell on loss, it does not seek restoration, it does not attempt to reclaim what it cannot name, but it also becomes constrained. It cannot imagine alternatives beyond what it has inherited. Its creativity operates within narrow bands. Its progress loops rather than expands. Its history feels ancient but unfinished. This condition persists because it is self-reinforcing. Each generation teaches the next only what it knows. Absence is transmitted as normality. The longer this continues, the less likely recovery becomes. By the time later civilizations begin to sense that something is missing, the missing age is already beyond reconstruction. There are no living witnesses, no procedural records, no language precise enough to describe what was lost. All that remains is a feeling, a sense that humanity started too late, that something foundational lies just beyond reach. Survivors who were never told what they survived cannot grieve properly. They cannot articulate loss. They cannot even be certain loss occurred. They live in a world shaped by subtraction without knowing subtraction happened. This is why the silence at the beginning of history does not feel tragic. It feels neutral. It feels like a starting point. Only much later, when patterns accumulate and inconsistencies persist, does the suspicion arise that something came before. But suspicion without evidence does not restore memory. It only creates longing, and longing without direction becomes myth. The erased age does not return as fact, it returns as possibility. The survivors continue, their descendants continue, civilization grows. But the knowledge of what was survived never arrives. And so the most complete erasure is not one where no one lives on. It is one where life continues, fully adapted, never realizing what it has been adapted away from. The silence does not feel imposed, it feels inherited, and that inheritance defines everything that follows. Myths are often dismissed as inventions, are symbolic stories created to explain a world that early humans did not yet understand. But this view assumes that myth emerges from ignorance. In reality, myth often emerges from damage. It is what memory becomes after it has been broken, compressed, and repeated without access to its original structure. A broken record still plays something real. It repeats fragments of a song that once existed in full. The melody is recognizable, but sections are missing. Timing is distorted, meaning blurs. What remains is not false, but incomplete. This is the role myth would play if an entire age had been erased. When lived experience can no longer be transmitted directly, it does not vanish all at once. It fractures. Details fall away first. Procedures disappear. Context thins. What survives are emotional contours, symbolic shapes, and repeated images that no longer explain themselves. Floods, golden ages, long-lived beings, gods walking among humans, sudden withdrawals, cosmic judgments. These motifs appear again and again across cultures that never contacted one another directly. They are not identical stories, but they share a structural rhythm. Something existed. It was different. It ended or changed. Humanity continued, diminished or altered. These are not coincidences. They are compression artifacts. If an age was removed, myth would be the only form of memory capable of surviving the removal. Not because myth is resilient, but because it is non-threatening. Myth does not teach method. It teaches mood. It preserves the feeling of difference without preserving the knowledge that made difference actionable. This is why myths feel profound but frustrating. They gesture towards something important while refusing to clarify it. They repeat key moments obsessively while omitting practical detail. They remember that something happened without remembering how it worked. A broken record does not invent new notes. It repeats what remains. The Sumerian myths do not describe humanity's beginnings as a slow rise from ignorance. They describe sudden structuring, decisions made by divine councils, roles assigned, limits imposed. The myths do not explain how these decisions were reached or what preceded them. They assume a context that no longer exists. This assumption is critical. Myths are not built from nothing. They are built on the expectation that the listener once knew more than the story now contains. When myths are first told, they function as reminders. Over time, as memory thins further, they become explanations. Eventually, they are treated as fiction. This progression marks the depth of erasure. If humanity once lived through an age that was later removed, myths would initially serve as compressed memory for those who survived the transition. Stories would preserve outlines of what was lost. But as generations passed, and no one remained who could connect story to lived experience, myths would lose their referent. They would become stories about gods instead of stories about conditions. This is why myths often attribute lost capacities to divine beings rather than humans. Long lifespans become traits of gods. Direct knowledge becomes revelation. Advanced understanding becomes magic. The human role in these stories shrinks as memory recedes. What was once shared becomes unreachable. Myths also repeat contradictions without resolving them. Gods create humans and then regret it. Gods teach humans and then punish them for knowing too much. Gods withdraw for reasons that are never fully explained. These inconsistencies are not narrative failures. They are signs of compression. When cause is removed, effect remains without explanation. A broken record skips the transition between notes. The jump feels jarring because the continuity is gone. The Anunnaki in myth are particularly revealing in this regard. They are present, powerful and authoritative, but their origin is vague. Their purpose shifts across texts. Sometimes they judge, sometimes they advise, sometimes they are barely mentioned at all. This inconsistency suggests not invention, but editing. If an age in which their role was clearer was removed, myths would retain fragments of their function without retaining the framework that made that function coherent. Myths would then behave like fossils embedded in narrative rather than stone, shapes preserved without flesh, impressions without organisms. This also explains why myths across cultures often feel more alike at their deepest level than at their surface. Names differ, details vary, but the structure persists. A time before limits, a disruption, a withdrawal, a diminished world afterward. These are not universal fantasies. They are universal residues. When an erased age can no longer be remembered directly, myth becomes the only vessel capable of carrying its shadow forward. But myth is not stable. Each retelling introduces distortion. Each translation compresses further. Each moral reframing shifts emphasis. Over centuries, what remains is not instruction, but warning. Do not seek forbidden knowledge. Do not challenge divine order. Do not ask how things used to be. The myths encode these warnings subtly, through the fates of characters who overreach, remember too much, or cross boundaries. These warnings are not abstract morality tales. They are safeguards. A society living atop erased memory must be discouraged from digging too deeply. Myth performs this function gently. It frightens without explaining why. It discourages without revealing what is being protected. This is why myths often feel like they are circling something rather than addressing it directly. They repeat key moments, key symbols, key tensions, but never resolve them. They cannot resolve them because resolution would require access to what was removed. Broken records do not play conclusions. They loop. Humanity, listening to these myths across generations, internalizes the loops, the sense that the past is inaccessible, that origins are unknowable, that authority is ancient and unquestionable, that the world began the way it is now. By the time myths are written down, the erasure is complete. Writing freezes the broken record at a particular point in its decay. What is lost at that moment is lost permanently. Later interpreters treat myths as imaginative creations rather than damaged memories. This misinterpretation is itself a consequence of erasure. A society that no longer remembers losing something cannot recognize what a broken record sounds like. It assumes the song was always fragmented. But myths behave differently from inventions. They persist stubbornly. They refuse to be replaced by better explanations. They adapt, but they do not disappear. They continue to resonate even when stripped of literal belief. This persistence suggests they are anchored to something deeper than storytelling instinct. They are anchored to memory that was never allowed to remain whole. If the Anunnaki erased an age, myths would be the unintended archive of that act. Not because they were designed to preserve it, but because complete erasure is impossible. Some residue always remains. Myth is that residue. It is not history. It is not fantasy. It is memory after removal. A broken record still plays something real, even if no one remembers the original song. Humanity hears the repetition and senses importance without understanding why. We feel that myths matter, even when we cannot say what they mean. That feeling is not irrational. It is recognition without access. As the narrative continues, these broken records shape how humans understand authority, limitation, and destiny. They teach submission without explanation. They preserve awe without clarity. And because they never resolve, they ensure that the erased age remains unreachable, not hidden, but fragmented beyond reconstruction. The myths do not lie. They simply cannot tell the whole truth anymore, and that is exactly what makes them safe to preserve. At some point, the Anunnaki cease to be described as active participants in the daily shaping of the world. They do not disappear entirely. They are still named, still present, still invoked. But their function changes. The shift is subtle, yet decisive. They are no longer teachers, builders, or organisers of human affairs. They become arbiters, overseers, figures associated with fate rather than formation. This change suggests not an absence of power, but a rejection of responsibility. To shape a world directly is to remain accountable to it. Teaching requires explanation. Guidance invites dialogue. Participation creates shared memory. All of these produce entanglement. If an earlier age involved the Anunnaki more deeply in human development, that role would have become increasingly unstable as humans learned, adapted, and began to understand the systems they lived within. Understanding erodes hierarchy. A teacher who remains present must answer questions. A collaborator must negotiate. A guide who stays too long eventually becomes one voice among others. If the Anunnaki wished to preserve long-term order rather than continual adjustment, there would come a point where stepping back was not abandonment, but strategy. The role they no longer wanted to play was that of visible architects. Architects are remembered. Their designs can be studied, replicated, improved, or challenged. Once humans understand how something is built, they no longer need the builder. They can build differently. This is dangerous. By withdrawing from that role, the Anunnaki transform themselves from sources of knowledge into sources of authority. Authority does not need to explain. It only needs to be obeyed. This transition is reflected in how the texts reposition them. They are increasingly associated with judgment, with the fixing of fate, with the finality of outcomes rather than the flexibility of process. They become the ones who decide what is allowed to continue. This change also removes them from blame. If they are no longer shaping the world, they cannot be held responsible for its imperfections. Suffering becomes inevitable rather than constructed. Limits become natural rather than imposed. Mortality becomes a condition rather than a policy. This is a powerful shift. When the Anunnaki are no longer teachers, humans stop expecting explanations. When they are no longer collaborators, humans stop seeing themselves as participants in cosmic order. When they are no longer builders, humans stop believing systems can be redesigned. What remains is acceptance. The myths encode this transition carefully. Early stories depict gods arguing, experimenting, even making mistakes. Later stories depict gods issuing decrees and enforcing consequences. The tone shifts from problem-solving to adjudication. This suggests a deliberate narrowing of role. If an entire age was erased, the Anunnaki's withdrawal from direct involvement would be necessary to complete that erasure. As long as they remained engaged as mentors or partners, memory would persist. Questions would be asked. Comparisons would be made. By redefining themselves as judges rather than guides, they sever continuity. Judges do not teach. They evaluate. This also explains why the Anunnaki are often portrayed as distant and impersonal. They are feared more than loved, respected more than understood. Their presence is felt most strongly at moments of death, crisis, and irreversible change. These are moments where questioning is least likely. A god who appears only at the end of a process cannot be interrogated about how the process began. If the Anunnaki no longer wanted to play the role of educators, it would not be because teaching failed. It would be because teaching succeeded too well. Humans learned enough to destabilize the structure that required oversight. The solution was not to destroy humanity, but to change the relationship. This reframing would allow humans to continue functioning within inherited systems while losing access to the knowledge that produced them. The Anunnaki would still enforce order, but no longer generate it openly. They would become custodians of outcome, not origin. This is why later traditions struggle to define them clearly. Their role is ambiguous because it has been reduced. They are not creators, not rulers, not teachers. They exist at the margins, appearing when balance is threatened or fate must be sealed. Ambiguity is useful. It prevents emulation. If humans cannot clearly define what the Anunnaki do, they cannot aspire to do the same. The role is removed from the realm of imitation. This is consistent with an erased age. Roles that humans once shared or observed closely are abstracted until they are unreachable. What was once visible becomes symbolic. What was once practical becomes metaphysical. The Anunnaki do not vanish, they are elevated out of reach. In doing so, they also avoid becoming part of history. Teachers leave footprints, judges leave verdicts. Footprints can be followed, verdicts cannot. This transformation ensures that the erased age remains inaccessible. Without mentors, humanity cannot recover methods. Without builders, humanity cannot study designs. Without collaborators, humanity cannot reconstruct dialogue. All that remains is compliance with outcomes. The Anunnaki's refusal to continue as active shapers of human development does not need to be framed as abandonment. It can be framed as completion. Their work is done. Order is established. Oversight is sufficient. From their perspective, this would be a success. From humanity's perspective, it would feel like the world had always been this way. This is the most effective form of withdrawal. Not departure, but redefinition. Not absence, but distance. The role they no longer wanted to play is the role that makes history reversible. By stepping away from that role, they ensure that the erased age stays erased. Not hidden behind walls or guarded by force, but dissolved into a world where no one knows what questions to ask. As the narrative continues, this withdrawal shapes every subsequent interaction between gods and humans. Communication becomes ritualized, knowledge becomes compartmentalized, authority becomes unquestionable. The Anunnaki remain, but only where they cannot be followed, and in doing so they complete the transition from shared past to managed present. The silence they leave behind is not empty, it is structured, and structure, once accepted, no longer requires explanation. Time is usually imagined as something that flows forward, accumulating layers as it goes. Even when civilizations collapse, time continues. People remember before and after. They count years differently, but they do not restart the count itself. A reset is something else entirely. A reset does not break time, it replaces it. If an erased age truly existed, then at some point time was not allowed to continue naturally. It was recalibrated. The Sumerian record hints at this more clearly than almost any other ancient tradition. Before a certain boundary, kings reigned for impossibly long spans. Tens of thousands of years pass under single rulers. After that boundary, reigns shorten abruptly. Time suddenly behaves differently. Lifespans compress. History becomes countable. Memory becomes manageable. This is not gradual evolution. It is discontinuity masked as order. A reset does not announce itself as an interruption. It presents itself as a correction. Time is not said to have been broken. It is said to have been set properly. The world before is framed as operating under different conditions, and the world after is framed as normal. Normality is always defined by whoever sets the clock. If time had simply continued, memory would have stretched backwards seamlessly. Even distorted memory would retain proportion. But a reset collapses proportion. It turns vast spans into mythic blur and recent spans into precise chronology. What came before becomes immeasurable. What comes after becomes exact. This is precisely what we see. The pre-flood world is not dated in the same way as the post-flood world. It exists in a different temporal category altogether. It is described but not measured. Named but not counted meaningfully. Its time is symbolic. The time after is administrative. That shift is not accidental. A reset would be necessary if the previous age had produced too much continuity. Long-lived humans would remember too far back. Institutional memory would extend beyond acceptable limits. Comparisons would persist. Authority would be contextualized. Shortening time solves this problem. When lifespans are reduced, memory becomes shallow. When reigns are shortened, continuity fractures. When generations turn over quickly, the past loses authority. Time, once reset, becomes a tool. The Anunnaki, associated with fate and decree rather than growth and process, would be ideally positioned to enforce such a recalibration. Fate is time stripped of alternatives. It defines endpoints rather than pathways. Resetting time does not require changing the sky or the sun. It requires redefining what counts. Calendars are not neutral. They decide when something begins. King lists do not merely record, they assert legitimacy. When a list begins, everything before becomes prehistory. Prehistory is where erased ages are placed. The flood functions as a temporal reset marker in Sumerian tradition, but it may not represent the original reset. It may be the narrative anchor used to explain an earlier, quieter recalibration. By the time the flood story is told, time has already been reorganized. The flood explains why the past feels unreachable. It gives a reason for forgetting without revealing the process. Resetting time also redefines causality. If time restarts, responsibility dissolves. No one is accountable for conditions that no longer officially existed. The past cannot be appealed to. Precedent disappears. This is essential for enforcing new limits. If humans could say, "This was different before," then the present would feel provisional. If they cannot say that, then the present feels eternal. A reset turns history into a one-way structure. Progress can be imagined forward, but regression becomes unthinkable. Restoration becomes mythic rather than practical. This is why golden ages are always placed impossibly far back. They are not meant to be reclaimed. They are meant to be admired at safe distance. A continued timeline invites comparison. A reset eliminates it. When time is reset, even language adapts. Words lose earlier meanings. Concepts narrow. What once required explanation becomes assumed. Temporal depth collapses into narrative simplicity. This process also explains why ancient cultures often believe they are living shortly after creation. Each sees itself near the beginning because the beginning has been repositioned. The true beginning lies beyond measurement. If an erased age existed, it would lie beyond the reset. The Anunnaki would not need to actively maintain this structure. Once time is redefined, institutions reinforce it. Scribes copy lists, priests recite genealogies, kings trace legitimacy to divine moments rather than historical development. Time becomes sacred rather than factual. Sacred time cannot be questioned. It exists outside cause and effect. It just is. Resetting time also alters how humans experience loss. When time is continuous, loss accumulates. When time is reset, loss is absorbed into myth. People do not mourn what they cannot locate. The reset would be the final seal on erasure. Even if fragments of memory survived earlier removal, reset in time would isolate them completely. They would become unanchored, floating, impossible to integrate. This is why later thinkers struggle to reconcile anomalies. Advanced knowledge appears too early. Structures appear without ancestors. The past feels deeper than it should. These are symptoms of a reset timeline. Time did not carry everything forward. It selected. When time was reset instead of continued, humanity did not lose history. It lost continuity. What followed was not ignorance, but containment. A world that functioned, progressed, and expanded, but within a narrower temporal horizon. The erased age does not sit behind us as a forgotten chapter. It sits beneath us, compressed into mythic depth where measurement no longer applies. And because time itself has been redefined, recovering that age becomes nearly impossible. You cannot return to what does not exist on the same timeline. This is why excavation alone cannot restore it. Why texts contradict. Why myths overlap but never align. Why the past feels both ancient and inaccessible. The reset succeeded because it did not feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. And once humanity accepted that beginning as real, everything before it became unreal by definition. Time moved forward. But something vast was left behind, not destroyed, not erased violently, but repositioned outside of time itself. And when something is placed outside time, it no longer competes with the present. It becomes untouchable. The silence deepens, not because time stopped, but because time was redirected. From this point on, history does not ask what came before. It records what is allowed to continue. When an age is erased through removal rather than destruction, not everything disappears. That would be inefficient. Systems still need to function. Life still needs to continue. Order still needs to be maintained. What vanishes is not all knowledge, but specific kinds of knowledge. What remains is chosen. This is why the aftermath of an erased age does not look like ignorance. It looks like uneven inheritance. Certain skills persist with remarkable stability. Agriculture continues. Astronomy remains accurate enough to structure calendars. Architecture retains proportions that work. Law functions. Administration expands. Humanity is not reduced to chaos. It is reduced to competence without comprehension. This distinction matters. If the Anunnaki erased an age, they would not remove everything humans had learned. They would remove what made humans independent, what allowed reconstruction rather than maintenance, what enabled participation rather than obedience. The knowledge left behind would be practical, repeatable, and bounded. The knowledge removed would be generative, adaptive, and explanatory. This pattern is visible everywhere in early civilization. People know how to do things, but not how those things came to be known. They can follow procedures without understanding principles. They can copy forms without modifying structures. They can preserve without innovating deeply. This is not accidental limitation. It is selective survival. Leaving knowledge behind on purpose requires restraint. It means deciding not only what to remove, but what must remain so the world does not collapse. The gods described in the Sumerian texts are capable of this kind of restraint. They are administrators of balance, not impulsive destroyers. Balance does not tolerate extremes. Too little knowledge produces chaos. Too much produces autonomy. The optimal state is function without self-direction. Knowledge that supports labour would remain. Knowledge that enables questioning authority would not. Knowledge that keeps agriculture productive would persist. Knowledge that explains cosmic mechanics in a way that invites replication would fade. This also explains why early civilizations excel at refinement but struggle with origin. They improve tools incrementally but rarely reinvent frameworks. They master techniques within inherited systems, but rarely question why those systems exist. The knowledge that remains feels ancient, authoritative, and unquestionable. This is why it is often framed as divine gift. Calling something a gift removes responsibility. You do not argue with a gift. You accept it. You use it. You preserve it. But you do not claim ownership of its origin. This framing is essential for maintaining erasure. If humans believed they had discovered agriculture, they might believe they could rediscover deeper principles. If they believed it was given, they would treat it as finite. The same applies to law, kingship, writing, and ritual. These are not described as evolving organically. They descend. They are bestowed. They arrive whole. This is not how human invention actually works, but it is how inherited systems appear once their origins are removed. Knowledge left behind on purpose also tends to be compartmentalized. It is distributed across roles rather than shared broadly. Farmers know farming, priests know ritual, scribes know writing, kings know command. No one knows everything. This segmentation prevents synthesis. An erased age might have allowed synthesis. Knowledge could have crossed boundaries. People might have understood how systems connected. Removing synthesis while leaving specialization creates dependence. Dependence stabilizes hierarchy. The Anunnaki, if they stepped back from direct involvement, would ensure that no single group could reconstruct what had been lost. Knowledge would be sufficient to maintain the world, but insufficient to reimagine it. This is why early texts emphasize obedience to roles. Each person must remain within their domain. Crossing boundaries invites chaos. This is presented as cosmic truth, not administrative policy. The knowledge left behind also tends to be durable. It survives transmission even when language changes. It can be encoded in practice rather than explanation. Seasonal planting, monument alignment, standardized measures. These do not require theoretical understanding to persist. Theoretical understanding is fragile. Removing theory while preserving practice ensures long-term stability. Practice can be taught through imitation. Theory requires explanation, memory, and debate. Debate is dangerous. This selective survival also explains why some advanced knowledge appears to vanish later. Metallurgy rises and falls. Mathematical sophistication fluctuates. Engineering techniques are lost and rediscovered. These losses are often attributed to collapse or neglect, but they may reflect deeper limits imposed earlier. When foundational theory is missing, applied knowledge degrades over time. Each generation maintains what it understands and loses what it does not. Over centuries, the inheritance thins further. This is not failure. It is the expected outcome of deliberate pruning. Knowledge left behind on purpose also carries a particular psychological weight. It feels older than the people using it. It feels authoritative. It resists change. People sense that it comes from somewhere else. This sensation produces reverence. Reverence discourages experimentation. Experimentation might reveal gaps. Gaps might invite questions. Questions might lead backward. Backward is where the erased age lies. By leaving behind knowledge that feels complete but unexplained, the Anunnaki would ensure that humanity never feels entitled to alter it fundamentally. They would create a world where progress happens sideways rather than inward. Incremental improvement replaces conceptual breakthrough. This is why later civilizations often circle the same ideas. Philosophies repeat. Political structures recur. Technologies evolve slowly within narrow channels. Radical shifts are rare and often short-lived. The knowledge left behind sets the ceiling. Everything above that ceiling becomes speculation or myth. The erased age, if it existed, would have operated above that ceiling. Its removal would make the ceiling feel like the sky. People would not know there was anything beyond it. This is the most complete form of control. Not restriction through force, but restriction through inheritance, giving enough to survive, but not enough to escape. The Anunnaki do not need to be remembered as villains for this to work. They do not need to be remembered at all in this context. Their role would be embedded in the structure of what remains. The knowledge left behind becomes the world, and the knowledge removed becomes unthinkable. This also explains why modern attempts to reconstruct lost ages often feel speculative. We sense depth, but cannot access it. We find fragments, but cannot assemble them. The missing pieces are not physical. They are conceptual. They were never meant to be passed down. If the Anunnaki erased an age, the most telling evidence would not be what is missing entirely, but what remains incomplete. Systems that function but do not explain themselves. Knowledge that works but does not teach. This is not the residue of collapse. It is the residue of selection. What humanity inherited was not ignorance. It was a carefully measured portion of understanding, enough to build, not enough to remember. An age that is erased does not vanish cleanly. Even when memory is removed, structure altered, and time reset, something persists. Not as knowledge, not as history, but as pressure. A missing weight in the shape of things, an echo that stretches forward long after its source is gone. This is the long echo of a missing age. It is not loud. It does not announce itself as loss. It appears as repetition, as cycles that never quite resolve, as civilizations that rise with confidence, reach a familiar limit, and then fracture in ways that feel strangely consistent across time and geography. Humanity does not remember what was taken, but it keeps encountering the boundary left behind. Echoes do not carry detail, they carry pattern. Across cultures separated by oceans and millennia, similar structures reappear. Divine hierarchies that sit above human authority. Sacred laws that are said to descend rather than develop. golden ages placed impossibly far back, warnings about forbidden knowledge, stories of watchers, judges and recorders rather than teachers. These repetitions are not proof of shared fantasy, they are symptoms of shared constraint. When an age is removed, the absence shapes everything that follows. Societies organise themselves around what is no longer available, even if they do not know what that is. They develop habits to compensate. Institutions arise to manage uncertainty. Religion becomes heavier where understanding is thinner. Authority becomes more rigid where context is missing. The echo does not tell us what the missing age was like. It tells us what the world feels like without it. This is why human history oscillates between confidence and collapse. Periods of expansion are followed by periods of contraction. Knowledge accumulates, but then fragments. Systems grow complex, then simplify. Each time humanity appears to approach a threshold it cannot cross. That threshold is not technological. It is conceptual. Again and again, civilizations build until they reach the ceiling of inherited understanding. They refine what they know, they optimize what they have. But when they attempt to reimagine foundational structures, progress stalls. Without access to deeper principles, innovation turns inward or sideways. The echo of the missing age is felt as frustration. It is the sense that answers should exist, but do not. That the past should explain more than it does. That systems work too well to have no origin story. That humanity is always rediscovering rather than discovering. This echo is also felt in philosophy. Questions about being, time, consciousness, and order recur endlessly. Thinkers circle the same problems in different languages. Insights are reached, but they rarely accumulate into irreversible understanding. Each generation restates what previous ones already sensed. Without access to the erased foundation thought loops, the echoes present in religion as well. Gods become increasingly abstract over time. Their personalities fade, their actions become symbolic. Rituals multiply as explanations thin. Faith grows where memory cannot reach. This is not spiritual failure. It is structural compensation. The echoes present in science too. Periods of rapid advancement are followed by crises of interpretation. Models work, but their meaning is debated endlessly. The deeper questions remain unsettled. Humanity becomes skilled at prediction without full comprehension. Again, competence without context. Even rebellion carries the echo. Revolutions promise new beginnings, but often reproduce old hierarchies. Attempts to flatten authority generate new forms of control. Humanity struggles to imagine systems that do not resemble what it has always known. Because something else once existed and is no longer available for reference. The Anunnaki, if they erased an age, did not need to manage this echo. It is automatic. Once a foundational layer is removed, everything built above it reflects the gap. No intervention is required. The system self-regulates. Humans fill the absence with belief, ideology, identity, and ambition. None of these resolve the echo. They only mask it temporarily. This is why the missing age does not feel like a mystery to be solved. It feels like a tension to be lived with. People sense that something is off, but cannot say what. That progress feels circular, that history repeats, that humanity advances and regresses in familiar patterns. The echo persists because it is not carried by memory, it is carried by structure. The way societies organize power, the way knowledge is gated, the way authority justifies itself, the way curiosity is encouraged up to a point and then discouraged. These patterns are inherited, not invented. The long echo also shapes how humanity relates to the idea of the future. There is optimism, but also anxiety, hope, but also a sense that something fundamental is missing. Visions of utopia often resemble past ideals more than new possibilities. Futures are imagined as restorations or corrections, not transformations. This suggests an unconscious awareness of loss. but because the loss cannot be named, it cannot be addressed directly. The echo is strongest where silence is deepest. At the beginning of time, at the origin of civilization, at the boundary between myth and history. These are the places where questions accumulate but answers dissolve. Humanity keeps returning to these points, not because it expects resolution, but because the pressure remains. The missing age does not pull us backward. It presses upward, shaping how far we can go. Every civilization, every philosophy, every system of belief operates within this constraint. Some push against it, some deny it, some sacralize it. None escape it. This is the true consequence of erasure. Not ignorance, but limitation without awareness. A world that functions, evolves and persists, but always within invisible bounds. The long echo is not a whisper from the past. It is the shape of the present. And as long as the erased age remains unremembered, its absence will continue to define humanity's path, not as a story we tell, but as a pattern we repeat. The silence is no longer behind us, it surrounds us, and it moves with us into everything that comes next. If an entire civilization was erased, not scattered by war, not buried by catastrophe, but deliberately removed from continuity, the most unsettling consequence would not be what was lost, it would be what remained. A civilization is more than buildings and tools. It is a way of organizing thought, a shared understanding of how the world works, why authority exists, how knowledge is passed on, and what limits are real versus imposed. To erase a civilization completely would require more than ending its cities. It would require dissolving its logic. And that kind of erasure would not look like collapse. If a civilization vanished through destruction, survivors would remember it as something that failed. Ruins would testify to its existence. Stories would circulate about its mistakes. Its lessons, however distorted, would persist. But if a civilization was erased through removal, its failure would never be acknowledged, because it would never be framed as failure at all. It would simply stop being part of the story. What follows such an erasure is not a return to primitiveness, but a continuation without reference. Humanity would move forward using inherited structures without knowing where they came from. Systems would persist, but their original intent would be gone. People would live inside a framework they did not build and could not fully explain. This is what makes the idea of a fully erased civilization so difficult to recognize. We expect lost civilizations to announce themselves through dramatic absence, but a removed civilization announces itself through subtle constraint. If such a civilization existed, it would likely have been highly integrated. Knowledge would not have been siloed. Authority would not have been absolute. Memory would not have been centralized. The strength of that civilization would also be its weakness. Integration creates resilience, but it also creates the potential for widespread understanding. Widespread understanding is dangerous to any system that depends on hierarchy. The erasure of such a civilization would not require eliminating its people entirely. It would require reconfiguring their descendants, narrowing access to knowledge, shortening memory, fragmenting roles, turning participants into operators. This is exactly the world that follows in the earliest historical records. Humans are capable, but constrained. Intelligent, but deferential. Creative, but repetitive. They build civilizations that look impressive, yet feel strangely derivative. The erased civilization, if it existed, would not be remembered as advanced in the modern sense. It would be remembered, if at all, as different, less rigid, less compartmentalized, less controlled by fixed authority. Its advancement would not lie in machines or monuments, but in understanding. That kind of advancement leaves little physical trace once memory is removed. Understanding cannot be excavated. If the Anunnaki erased an entire civilization, they would not need to erase its achievements. They would only need to erase the conditions that allowed those achievements to arise. Without those conditions, the civilization could not re-emerge, even if fragments survived. This is why later civilizations often feel like echoes rather than successors. They resemble something incomplete. They rediscover techniques but not frameworks. They reproduce patterns without mastering principles. They live in the shadow of something they cannot see. An erased civilization would also explain the persistent sense that human history begins too late. That writing appears suddenly. That law arrives already formalized. That social hierarchy emerges without visible experimentation. These are not beginnings. They are resumptions. But resumptions without memory feel like origins. If an entire civilization was erased, it would not appear in the archaeological record as a missing chapter. It would appear as an unnatural smoothness, as a lack of developmental debris, as a world that seems to skip steps. The absence of struggle in early records is telling. Humanity is depicted as already adapted to agriculture, already organized into cities, already governed by law. There is little record of trial and error, little documentation of failure. This is not because early humans did not struggle. It is because the struggle belonged to an erased context. The civilization that was removed may have been the one that struggled, experimented, failed, and learned. What follows inherits the results without the process. This would also explain why humanity repeatedly rebuilds similar structures across time and geography. Without access to deeper alternatives, the same solutions are rediscovered again and again. Monarchy, priesthood, bureaucracy, law codes, hierarchical cosmology. Each civilization believes it is inventing these structures. None realize they are constrained to them. The erased civilization would represent the last time humanity existed outside this constraint. Its removal would mark the point where history becomes cyclical rather than exploratory. And because it was erased before writing solidified, it could not be recovered through text. Because it was erased through removal rather than destruction, it left no ruins that clearly belonged to it. Because it was erased by narrowing memory rather than eliminating people, it left descendants who did not know what they no longer carried. This is why the idea of an erased civilization feels speculative rather than demonstrable. The evidence is not material, it is structural. It is found in what humanity cannot seem to do, in the ceilings we repeatedly hit, in the questions that recur without resolution, in the sense that something foundational is missing, yet unreachable. If an entire civilization was erased, its greatest legacy would not be technology or monuments. It would be absence, an absence that shapes everything that follows without ever being named. And because that absence does not announce itself as loss, humanity adapts to it fully. We build identities within it. We explain the world using it. We defend it as natural. The erased civilization becomes impossible not because it never existed, but because its conditions are no longer imaginable. This is the final consequence of erasure. Not forgetting a people, but forgetting a way of being. And once a way of being is forgotten completely, history cannot return to it. It can only circle around the gap it left behind. As the story approaches its final quiet reflection, what remains is not certainty, but a shift in perspective. The possibility that human history is not incomplete because it is ancient, but because it was edited, not violently, carefully, and that the world we inhabit is not the first version of itself, but the most stable one allowed to remain. As the story slows, it does not ask to be concluded. It only asks to be set down gently, the way a thought is set aside when the mind begins to loosen its grip. There is no final answer waiting at the end of this idea, and there does not need to be. What matters is not certainty, but the shape of the question we've been walking around. If an entire age was erased, if memory was thinned rather than burned, if time was reset instead of continued, then the world we inhabit is not incomplete in the way ruins are incomplete. It is complete in the way a carefully edited text is complete. Everything necessary remains. Everything destabilizing has been removed. The result functions, endures, and reproduces itself. That kind of completeness is difficult to notice because it does not feel like loss. It feels like normal. The silence at the beginning of history does not shout because it is not empty. It is occupied by structure, by limits that feel natural, by systems that work well enough to avoid questioning. Humanity grows, builds, argues, believes, and wonders, all within a framework that feels self-evident. If something came before, it does not press against us as memory. It presses as boundary. This is why the idea of an erased age lingers without ever resolving. It does not demand belief. It does not insist on proof. It simply reframes the unease that sometimes appears when we look too far back and find the path narrowing sooner than expected. What if the reason certain questions never quite open is not because they are unanswerable, but because the answers once belonged to a context that no longer exists? What if the reason history feels both ancient and shallow is because its depth was deliberately reduced? These are not thoughts meant to keep the mind alert. They are thoughts meant to soften it, to allow the past to remain quiet without forcing it to speak, to recognize that not every silence hides a secret waiting to be uncovered. Some silences are the result of choices made long ago, choices that succeeded so completely they no longer feel like choices at all. The world does not feel broken. It feels stable. It feels familiar. It feels constrained only if you press against its edges, and most of the time there is no reason to press. Civilizations continue. Knowledge accumulates. Stories are told. Myths repeat themselves. Humanity moves forward, not realizing it is moving within a shape that was set before memory begins. If there was an erased age, it is not watching us. It is not waiting to be rediscovered. It is not hidden beneath stone or ice. It is already finished. Its role was to end. What remains is a world that learned how to forget without suffering. That kind of forgetting does not feel violent. It feels like sleep. Thoughts slow. Details blur. The mind stops insisting on resolution. The question remains, but it no longer needs to be answered. If something was taken, it was taken gently enough that life continued. And if life continued, perhaps that was always the intention. The quiet thought to carry with you is not about gods or civilizations or erasure. It is about perspective, about how much of what feels permanent might simply be inherited structure, about how silence can shape a world without announcing itself. As you rest, the story does not close, it simply drifts. The past stays where it is, the present remains intact, and the mind, no longer required to hold on to certainty, is free to let go. The world hums quietly, time moves forward. The silence does not demand attention. It only remains, and in that remaining there is nothing that needs to be resolved before sleep arrives.